Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hello, everyone. How are you? How are you? Sorry, aggressive. I hope you're doing well. My name's Connor if you're new, and we are going to learn about feudalism today. Take your seat. Preemptive Light, Kings in General, great channel. Let's do it.
Most people, whether fans of history or not, will have come into contact with the concept of feudalism in one way or another, and will have heard terms such as feudalism, vassals, and lords used to describe the legal and social structures that made up the period known as the Middle Ages. This is understandable, as up until the 1990s, the majority of historical research assumed that the feudal pyramid was the overarching system that defined the economic, social, and military fabric of the medieval era. However, the feudal system and its origins have been much less clean-cut in light of more recent research.
So is feudalism dependent on... Is a society being... Is feudalism dependent on a monarch, or can you be a non-monarchical feudalist society? I wonder.
Modern historians are far more divided as to when and how the feudal system came into being, and whether it is at all suitable for describing the complexity of the European Middle Ages with its many regionalisms, cultures, legal systems, and forms of organization.
What's his name? The king in England. He was so cool. The guy that with the crown guy, Kings of England. I'll be able to pick him out. List of English monarchs. Give me the list. I think Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great. I remember learning about Alfred the Great and what he set up after defending against the Danelaw, the Vikings, and that settled in Eastern and Central Eastern British Isles. When he defeated them, it seems like King Alfred the Great set up a system that looks like the starts of feudalism, but I don't know if he pioneered it or if you know, he got it elsewhere.
With these introductory words, we welcome you to our video, in which we explore what everyone got wrong about the feudal system, and how our understanding of it has changed in the present day.
Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
Before we get to the deconstruction of the feudal system, we should first take a look at the outlines of older research. The classical model by which historians understood the emergence of medieval feudalism developed at the turn of the 20th century, and still filled university handbooks as late as the 1980s. This model assumed that the feudal system developed in the 8th century, under the Carolingian dynasty, which practiced components of vassalage and fiefdoms inherited from the late Roman Empire, the idea of commendation, as well as the customs of the early Germanic people. The term commendation derives from the Latin si commendare, to entrust oneself to someone. In the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, it was a practice where a free man placed himself under the protection of a more powerful man in order to receive a form of maintenance and protection. In return, the subordinate was now obliged to serve and obey his new lord. This form of subordination was not exactly attractive, as one was a subject to a master out of unfavorable reasons.
Well, compared to what exactly? It's not like you're living in a modern day society and then you get put into that. Yeah, that doesn't seem great. But I'm not going to assume that other places had very much better of a deal. All right, it's got to be relative.
Nevertheless, this was a common practice in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. The other, more attractive personal component of vassalage was thought to have emerged from the oaths of allegiance sworn by warriors and lesser chiefs towards greater chiefs among the ancient Germanic peoples. However, this practice was likely not Germanic in origin, but was probably an adoption of Roman military oaths, which were first adopted by the Germanic peoples when they entered into the service of the empire after migrating into Roman territory, and in continued use by the powerful even after the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Both of these forms of allegiance formed the personal basis for medieval vassalage as it was understood by 20th century historians. Older research assumed that fiefs, the material component of feudalism, could be found in abundance in the sources of the 8th and 9th centuries under the term beneficium. Mostly, these beneficia were legal transactions in the widely used legal practice of the precarium loan. In this practice, a person is asked for the temporary use of another person's property, usually land, without the borrower receiving ownership rights. The reasons for entering into such an agreement were manifold, and mostly favorable for both parties. However, what was most important about this precarium loan was its flexibility in usage, and the fact that it created social ties by dividing ownership and use between two parties for a certain period of time. Older scholarship translated
having mutual goals,
most of these parties
or maybe not mutual goals, but mutual benefactor, mutual. You both want the farm to be productive, let's say.
Period of time. Older scholarship translated most of these precarium loans on the basis that these were particularly favorable to the person requesting them, simply as fiefs, and concluded that they were issued by lords to vassals in return for military service. Thus, issued by lords requesting them, simply as fiefs, and concluded that they were issued by lords to vassals in return for military service.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy. You have the person who's control of most of the land, and then you have the people who are given control from that main guy to have this land, where they then have people on that land that work for them, and they get accommodations. And then in return, you know, if you're called upon, then you have to answer for, say, military service or something.
In a short time.
See, this is all stuff that I imagine would happen no matter what. You know, like if you were to wipe the memories of everyone on Earth, right? And we had no idea of our past civilization. We essentially went back to the Stone Age and we had no memory of our prior civilization. I'm sure something similar to this would rise up again. It's fascinating, not just in a historical sense, but in a human sociological sense, you know?
The elements of personal loyalty in the form of commendation and warrior oaths merged with the granting of land in the form of precarium loans and formed the feudal system, whereby the warlike period of the 8th century in particular was thought to be a catalyst leading to the development of the feudal system. The driving force for the spread of this new practice was thought to be the need for more cavalry soldiers. It was suggested that besides the internal struggle for supremacy over the realm of the Franks, the confrontation with forces from the border regions of Europe led to a change in the composition of the Frankish army.
Well, the Huns were in like the 300s, I think, but okay.
Europe
this steppe warriors who had horses.
led to a change in the composition of the Frankish army. In contact with the agile cavalry warriors of the Arabian sphere and the Avars,
Arabia.
as well as the need for a rapid reaction force against the raids of the Norsemen, Frankish armored horsemen had replaced peasant foot soldiers. As the more expensive and time-consuming equestrian service required greater material resources than that of a foot soldier,
Training,
the
yeah.
horsemen needed to be financially equipped. This is where the practice of granting fiefdoms in the form of precarium loans was believed to have intensified. It was stated that Charles Martel had requisitioned property from the large lands that church institutions held and issued it as fiefs to his men in order to obtain more cavalry warriors that were bound to him as vassi with the above-mentioned practices. However, Pippin the Younger and Karlman, the sons of Charles Martel,
Peregrine Took. I'm reading Lord of the Rings at the moment, sorry.
Pippin the Younger and Karlman, the sons of Charles Martel, wanted to return the requisitioned property to the church in the middle of the 8th century. Naturally, both kings did not want to go without the military potential of their vassi, and could not simply dispossess them of the granted lands.
What do you mean return? What?
So they resorted to a trick. The church received their land back, but had to hand it over directly to the vassi as precarium loans, who could thus continue to perform their military service for the king. This model quickly spread throughout the Frankish Empire. The church received their land back, but had to hand it over directly to the vassi as precarium loans, who could thus continue to perform their military service for the king.
Precarium loan? You can fast forward if you want. Precarium loan is a gratuitous loan of or grant of property that can be recalled or revoked at any time by the lender or grantor. It's essentially a tenancy at will where the borrower has no... Okay. So there's like no contract or anything that like, I'm going to give you this land and like I can take it back whenever I want to. Okay.
This model
Hopefully that definition stands in
could
this
thus
case.
continue to perform their military service for the king. This model quickly spread throughout the Frankish Empire, and ecclesiastical and secular magnates adopted it. From their own property, or from land that they themselves had received as a fiefdom from the king, they gave land to their subordinates as a sub-fief. Furthermore,
I mean, what better way could you possibly do this? So the person playing the main game is obviously the person at the top, or people at the top, the king and the very powerful people. And what are you going to do? Like, what other alternative is there? I conquer this area, I conquer this area, I conquer this area. So... are you just going to say, all right, these are all my lands now, they belong to the king, and I'm going to go around constantly and ensure that everything is going by my will, you know? Especially in a time when, I always say instant communication, insanely revolutionary, but in a time where travel was long and tiring and communication was slow, then that's going to end up in disaster. And what happens if it ends up in disaster? You no longer exist anymore. And so the system that is going to prevail is going to be one like this, where you capture an area, capture an area, capture an area. Then you have people who are loyal to you, get this giant, powerful position now. You're the boss of this area, and those people around there can be subject to you. But in the end, you're still answering to me. I'm the main guy, you know? And so that just seems like a very logical playing of how a successful system would play out.
it was also
You know?
thought that many officers...
If I'm saying anything you disagree with, please let me know in the
as a
comments.
sub-fief. Furthermore, it was also thought that many officers, such as bishoprics, dukes, and counts, were bound to the king in this way as vassals. Thus, early medieval society under the Carolingians was believed to have become a feudal society, shaped by a straightforward system that was based on land grants for personal loyalty between lords and vassals. As control over land was the central resource in the early Middle Ages, it was thought that besides military organization, politics and the economy developed alongside the lines of the feudal system. Over time,
Naturally.
the hereditary nature of the fiefs developed, so that the king's access
Classic.
to the landed property of the nobility, and thus the royal
Right, obviously the main king is going to hand his power down to his own kin, and the leaders of the areas of the fiefdoms are going to do the same thing to their kids. It just, I don't know if okay, am I being too pessimistic about human... It's not about just go.
power. The king's access to the landed property of the nobility, and thus the royal power, dwindled. The feudal system mutated. The monograph Fiefs and Vassals, the Medieval Evidence Reinterpreted, by British historian Susan Reynolds, released in 1994, presented a particular turning point for this model of the social structure of the early Middle Ages, and thus the subsequent development of the medieval epoch. Reynolds' critique mostly pointed out that research up to this point had often interpreted and translated terms found in the early medieval sources in a too narrow view. She rightly noted that words such as vassal or fief are not as commonplace in the sources as they are made out to be. Moreover, when they do appear, they do not automatically have to be read in the model of the feudal system, especially not in the context of a lord-vassal relationship that is mostly based on military service. Yet, older research did exactly that, and was thus very intentional and one-sided with the translation of source terms. As already mentioned, terms such as vassi and beneficia can be found in the charters originating in the Frankish world from the 6th century onwards. However, Susan Reynolds showed that these terms were rarely as unambiguous in the early Middle Ages as older research depicted them. Only on rare occasions were the charters of the time precise in the terminology and usage. Thus, the older research depicted them. Only on rare occasions were the charters of the time precise in the terminology and usage. Thus, the interpretation as a lord and vassal relation.
Right, people of the past aren't writing down everything that they write down or creating everything that they create in order to make it so that people in the far future can easily dissect what they mean. Of course not. You're in the present, and you're going to be using terms in the same way that we would use terms now. And so to assume that, I feel like historians should assume that right away, and that shouldn't be very difficult to think of it that way. Am I being
Thus,
too
the
critical?
interpretation as a lord and vassal relationship who exchanged loyalty and lands for military service, advice, and protection is only in very few cases the most likely. Similarly, a large number of other words such as fidelis, confidante, hominis, and militias were liberally interpreted as vassals and thought of directly in the context of feudalism, without taking into account the ambiguity of these terms.
See, that seems like something that a well-educated scholar or historian shouldn't be that difficult to understand. They should know that, right? I feel like I'm not being too harsh here.
Well, the precise background.
You should know that, like, history isn't this thing that is laid out for you to understand. It's something that you have to find out, and not everything is going to be precise.
Might have in a charter. In many cases, however, the sources distinguish quite clearly between these different terms, and do not depict them in any form of a lord and vassal relationship. The term beneficium is also far more ambiguous in its use in the sources. It encompasses a range of phenomena and practices corresponding to its basic meaning of a benefice, and could refer to a broad range of land loans or benefiting events. Historical research from the 1930s and 40s were not unaware of this, but undertook the step of excluding all beneficia from the peasant rural area of life from their consideration, as these These so-called peasant fiefs could not be compared with knightly or vassal fiefdoms. Unsurprisingly, this artificial scientific separation led to a narrowing of the terms, which otherwise would have had...
Okay, now I'm being hypocritical against my own words. But I don't think that would be too crazy to separate the two. Not saying that... Okay.
Had a variety of meanings and uses in the early medieval sources. Furthermore,
a more structured fiefdom is going to have more structure to it, obviously. That doesn't mean that the similar rules won't apply, right?
Meanings and uses in the early medieval sources. Furthermore, regional developments and local particularities were not really taken into further consideration while interpreting the sources. Thus, the terminology in the sources must be taken seriously in the context of the individual source, because what a vassus provided and what the beneficium was that was received is often not as clearly stated as the concept of feudalism makes it out to be. In addition, some of the basic developments that are assumed by older research about the origins of the feudal system are not as strongly proven as they seem, and have since been reconsidered in the wake of Reynolds' studies. To begin with, the assertion of older research that Charles Martel confiscated church property and issued it in exchange for military service is not proven. In fact, there is hardly any evidence for the confiscation of church property on a broad basis from the sources of Charles Martel's time. The fact that Pippin the Younger and his brother Carloman restituted church property under their reign is also not based on a large number of surviving precarium loan contracts.
Yeah, sorry, I was confused about that earlier. I should have...
Their reign is also not based on a large number of surviving precarium loan contracts, but only on the result of a single synod held in 743 or 744 in Estins. Although this synod mentions the connection between military service and precarium loans, it speaks of an impending war for which church property was to equip warriors for a limited period of time. There is no hint that this was a common practice, or that it had the restitution of an already alienated property at its core. Furthermore, the idea that officials such as bishops, counts, and dukes were bound to the king as vassals is one formed on a foundation of sand. During the whole Carolingian period, sources differentiated between vassals of the king and holders of office, the latter often singled out by the officer's terminology. The vassals are strictly separated in enumerations in the sources, and find themselves behind the magnates and holders of office. Newer research suggests that the binding between an office and a corresponding fief only emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the emergence of stronger institutionalization in the proto-state. Thus, bishops, counts, and dukes were not bound to the king as vassals by a hierarchical structure of fiefs, but by other means of loyalty, trust, and consensus within the elite. To make matters worse, the German historian Roman Deutinger pointed out that he could not make out one single sub-vassal in the sources of the Frankish Empire from the 8th and 9th centuries. As we have demonstrated, the historical reality contained in the early medieval sources was much more diverse than the historical reality reconstructed by older research. So much more diverse, in fact, that the concept of feudalism is unable to capture it. To use the words of Roman Deutinger, a system that allows a myriad of exceptions and can only be proven in a few individual cases is no longer a system, but simply a fiction. Today.
And, I mean, a territory that isn't able to have a common cause and a well-structured system will fall. I mean, it's survival of the fittest. If you are not able to quickly and efficiently get an army together to fight against an outside power, then you're going to be conquered and you're going to fall and someone else will take your place. And so, although I understand the complexities of all this stuff and you can't just have a stamp and be like, okay, feudalism, this is a fief, all these are the same. Of course you can't do that. But you can also infer that you're going to have some structure if you're going to be successful and lasting, you know? So, you know what I mean?
The image of Carolingian rule is, therefore, less one of a centralized empire with the system of feudalism as its dominating structure at its core, and more one of diverse personal ties and practices, which were used skillfully and flexibly by contemporaries, opening up relationships that went far beyond the duality of lord and vassal. Therefore, the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies elsewhere. According to...
Well, since feudalism is a term created very recently, then, I mean, what he just said.
Duality of lord and vassal. Therefore, the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies elsewhere.
I'm sure there isn't a one... That's like saying that there has to be this link between species, right? It's like, no, there was never a time where one species just gave birth to a completely different species. It was steps and steps along the way until it was unrecognizable. And so, since feudalism, I've learned in this video for the first time, I didn't know it before, is a 20th century term, then that means that looking for the origin of feudalism is folly. I mean, there's going to be no origin. There's just going to be connections back to prior and prior civilizations where each of those civilizations stood on the shoulders of another that had some kind of common thing. I mean, I'm sure it was in the Roman Empire when you conquered new people or new people came into your territory to be like, hey, obviously, all right, you're in our territory. If you stay here and we won't kill you, you have to do this, this, and this. You have to be loyal to Rome. This is where you're going to work. And if not, then piss off, you know? Like, that had to have happened. And I'm sure that structure existed before the Roman Empire. And so it's a pointless task trying to find out the start of a feudalism, a term that you created nowadays, you know?
According to Susan Reynolds and others, the origins of feudalism lie in northern Italy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. During those centuries, the emerging jurists of that region studied the Roman law codes that had remained in partial legal use in Italy long after the fall of the Roman Empire. Inspired...
Sorry, what was the date? 11th and 12th century.
By the clear structure of the Roman law codes, these early lawyers tried to structure, categorize, and regulate the diverse practices regarding noble inheritance, loyalty, fiefs, land loans, military duty, breaches of duty, and the difference between a noble and a commoner's fief. Moreover, they tried to stratify who was even able to be granted a fiefdom, and on what basis. Within these treatises, the legal scholars attempted to make a strong connection between fiefs and vassalage. In doing so, the jurists attempted to break down the diverse legal practices of their own environment, which often gave rise to conflicts, in order to create basic and clear-cut normative principles that would result in regional stability and easier work for them. Within this, the strict categories and terms of vassals and lords and their relationship along the idea of vassalage emerged. Through the increased spread of these texts and the intensified dissemination of written and codified law in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, the work of these Italian jurists was more and more used to define what a fief was, thereby separating the concept of a fief from other forms of land loans and practices.
Interesting.
Reynolds argues that in the later 16th century, lawyers specializing in feudal law took up these texts in order to explain the medieval world and its ruling mechanisms according to these legal texts. Historians of the 19th century then took on this early modern picture as their own.
Sorry, I was thinking about something. I think that psychology and lawyering are so connected to each other. Like, I feel like in a way, what is the term for being a lawyer? I'm going to use the term lawyering. Lawyering is an image, lawyering is how we deal with humans. Therefore, psychology. It's like a study of psychology, sort of, and sociology, you know? Maybe that's more obvious to some people, or maybe I'm wrong.
Rising in feudal law took up these texts in order to explain the medieval world and its ruling mechanisms according to these legal texts. Historians of the 19th century then took on this early modern picture as their own canvas to paint models and systems of the Middle Ages on it. When this critique is taken seriously, one concludes that the common idea of a universal feudal system was just that, the idea of jurists who tried to categorize and differentiate the diverse practices of human ways of life and their connections into only a few strict cases and categories. Where does this
And if you can't do that better than another power near you, then you're gonna fall.
leave historiography with regard to the feudal system? Today, most historians follow Reynolds' critique and thought, with some added nuances of their own. In recent years, historians have suggested using a more source-oriented terminology for the early Middle Ages, in order to move away from the artificial terms and unfitting translations previously used in the research discourse when it comes to fiefs and vassals in the early and high Middle Ages. Furthermore, regional studies on feudalism and its corresponding origins and particularities became a staple in research. In doing so, historians try to grasp the facts and concepts of fiefdoms, vassals, loans, personal relations, and so forth that are definitely present in the sources as close to the sources as possible. After all, the lending of land, offices, sovereignty, and property rights remains a defining phenomenon in medieval European history. More videos about history's most
I feel like you could see a lot of similarities with how society is structured today, even in republics and democracies.
common misconceptions are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Great video. I don't have much to say other than what I've said during the video. When I said it was folly to try and find the start of feudalism, I don't mean that, like was later said later in the video after I said that about the people in northern Italy. That doesn't mean that it's useless or folly to try and find the origin of some practices in one part of history that started. So I'm not saying that's impossible. So again, often when I learn about history, I love learning about history. I love it so much. But a lot of it isn't just learning about historical events. A lot of it is just me being fascinated by how humans work and how humans structure themselves. And it's easy, I think, a lot of times to kind of look back at these people as a different species or an alien, right? When they're literally, like, we are a blink of an eye evolutionarily from these people. We are genetically, I'm sure, 99.999999999 continue the nines, 10 more nines % identical to people that lived 800 years ago, you know? And so it's a story of how you and I, it's an insight as to how I think you and I would structure society in a similar time. And I think it's a lot about human nature, none of these particular individuals. I'm confusing myself. I hope everyone's doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. If you disagree with anything I said was wrong, call me out in the comments. Would love nothing more. And you guys are always great at answering any questions I have. I hope I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.